cell phones, any mobile devices, and find your seats. And do be careful if you are sitting in the first row to be mindful of the camera if you have to leave, because you could walk in front of it. Thank you. If you have if you have any questions for the panel, please hold up your question card and we will collect those. You can also ask any questions via social media. You'll periodically see the hashtag and how to direct those during the program. And again, I remind you to please silence your cell phones. We'll be beginning in a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to New America for this wonderful space. I'd now like you to help me welcome Gloria Blackwell, AAUW Vice President of Fellowships, Grants, and Global Programs. Gloria.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of AAUW's new research report, Deeper in Debt, Women and Student Loans. I'm Gloria Blackwell, AAUW Vice President of Fellowships, Grants, and Global Programs. Research is the hallmark of AAUW, and we have more than 130 years of expertise in debunking myths about women and girls in education and the workplace. As a matter of fact, our very first research report released in 1885, disproved the ridiculous theory that excessive amount of studying required for college would result in infertility for women. We are so thankful that archaic and misguided notions about women no longer exist today. Well, mostly they don't. Deeper in Debt pulls back the curtain on the impact of student loans on women, who are more likely than men to take on student debt and tend to borrow more than their male counterparts. The members of AAUW recognized the challenges of college affordability by offering our very first fellowship over a century ago. And thanks to the generous contributions of our members, fellowships and grants funding has grown to over $3.7 million annually, with over $100 million awarded since 1888. And we remember the stories of those early women who were unable to attend lectures or labs or had to sit behind a partition so that they wouldn't distract or disrupt their male counterparts. From that, we hope that all of you will use AAUW's research for informed activism to pave the way for all women in higher education. In a moment, my colleague, Kevin Miller, AAUW's senior researcher, will share key findings and important recommendations from this timely and very important report. But first, let's take a moment to find out why this issue is so important. Just a moment.
Wait for it.
Well, there's me.
College students are more diverse than ever before, and most students are now women. The majority of students are also taking on student debt, many from the moment they enter college. Women take on more debt than men, and whether they complete a degree or not, that debt follows students when they leave college. Though debt follows both men and women as they start the next phase of their lives, women working full-time are paid about 20% less than men. As a result, women pay back their loans more slowly. This means accruing more interest. While taking more time to pay back more debt, women are less able to afford the next steps in their lives: stability, security, savings, and aspirations. Find out more about what we can do to keep college affordable and keep women out of debt at deeperindebt.org.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kevin Miller.
Right, thank you, Gloria. This is the best welcome I've ever received in my entire life. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start the presentation today by making a couple of points about why we're here. So student debt is affecting most college students at this time, but it is disproportionately affecting women. And so far, very few people have been talking about that. So we're here today to change that conversation. Second, I want to point out that student debt affects people who did what they were supposed to do. Our parents and teachers and employers all tell us that we need to go to college. And somehow we have to pay for that, and the answer is usually through student loans. So I would just want to point out that the people we're talking about here in the abstract and in the statistics are real people who've just done what they were supposed to do in their life. So I apparently have a clicker. But that was backwards. Okay. So, as you all know, women are really succeeding in higher education. Women are now most of the college students in the country, and most of the college students are actually more diverse than before. So the face of college is just very different than it used to be. But unfortunately, the price of college is also different than it used to be, and it's much higher. So student loans are filling in the gap between the price of college and what people can afford, to the tune of about $1.3 trillion. Because women take on larger loans than men, and because they have lower incomes, it takes them longer to pay back this debt. So overall, AAUW estimates that women owe almost 2/3 of outstanding student debt, to the tune of about $830 billion as of the end of 2016. So how did we get here? So part of the answer is that, again, enrollments have changed. So the left pie is 1976 and the right pie is 2014. And the blue slice is white men, the gold slice is white women, and then the other cool colors are men of color, and the other warm colors are women of color. And so you can see that the student body is just very different than it was 40 years ago. In particular, it's worth pointing out that there are now about as many women of color in college as there are white men. And they experienced just massive gains in this 40-year period. The number of Hispanic women in college increased by a factor of 10 between 1976 and 2014. So things are very different in terms of who's in college. And again, here we can see that the price of college has really gone up while incomes haven't. So between 1976 and 2014, there's been almost no movement in the median household income, while the price of attendance at college in the United States has more than doubled. So in terms of who borrows and how much, I have a spoiler alert, it's women. But there's some details and breakdowns, obviously. So this figure shows us actually a few breakdowns. So the top half is bachelor's degree debt, the bottom half is sub-bachelor's degree debt. We also have breakdowns by gender and by year. So one of the things we can see, if you go blue, orange, purple, is that in constant dollars, women and men are both taking out more debt as time goes on. The other thing we can see pretty clearly between women and men is that women are taking on reliably, at all levels, more debt than men. We can also break this down by race. And here the numbers look, again, unfortunately, probably like you would expect them to. So Black and Hispanic borrowers very reliably, unfortunately, take on more debt than white and Asian borrowers. Black women are actually the most likely to take on debt and take on the most debt. So at bachelor's degree graduation, Black women have taken on average, about $30,000 in debt. So there's much larger than, say, white men, by about $10,000. But it's also important to think about the different types of institutions where men and women are enrolled. So this figure breaks down the price of attendance versus how people are paying for college by types of institution. The leftmost set of bars is public four-year schools like the University of Maryland or Virginia. The next over is private not-for-profits like the Ivy League. The next over is community colleges, and then the farthest right is for-profit colleges. The blue bars are the average price of attendance in that category of school, and the purple bars are the average expected family contribution of students at those types of schools. So that's the amount that the federal government thinks those students and their families can afford to contribute to their education. The orange bars, why we're here today, the orange bars are how much are the average debt taken on by students at these types of institutions. So you can see right away that there are some patterns. Community college is much more affordable, and their students take on much less debt than other schools. Public four years also have somewhat less debt than private schools. It's important to point out that the EFCs are also very different at these types of schools. So private not-for-profit schools have students who have wealthier family backgrounds than students going to for-profit colleges. So while the amount of debt taken on at private not-for-profit and private for-profit schools is sort of similar, the ability of people to repay may be different, and the ability of people to get family help may be different. So once people have debt, what happens? I think most of you know the answer, that there's an email or letter in your inbox or mailbox that says, start paying us back. But I think it's important to take a moment to talk about students who don't finish college. Unfortunately for these students, even if they don't finish school, they still get that letter. And so these students are facing a worst of both worlds outcome, where they have no credential to increase their earnings, but they still owe debt. And so they are also more likely to default on their loans. And so what this means is their debt is sent to collections, their credit is ruined, but also, maybe more importantly for us in the room and watching at home, they also are less likely to ever be able to receive a future loan. So they may never go back to school. But for those who do graduate, we see reliably very large increases in their earnings. So this is data on the average earnings across the workforce in the United States by gender and race and degree level. So the orange bars are the average weekly earnings of people with high school diplomas, and the purple bars are the average weekly earnings of people with bachelor's degrees. So you can see that across all races and genders, there's a very reliable effect for college of increasing incomes. However, we also see here the effects of the gender pay gap. So overall, we can see that regardless of education level, men at that education level are paid more than women at that education level. And we also see that there are race gaps as well, where Black and Hispanic earners who have a college degree also have lower incomes than white or Asian earners with a college degree. So unfortunately, the combination of higher debt for some borrowers and lower earnings for some borrowers makes it much more difficult to repay loans. So this is true for women, and it's also true for people of color. In this figure, we have a wide array of numbers. I would just point you to the far right column, which is the percent of debt that was paid off annually by students graduating in 2008 who were followed through 2012. Overall, men paid off about 13% of their debt per year, and women paid off about 10% of their debt per year. This comes out to about a 2-year difference in terms of who finishes paying first. Men finish about 2 years faster than women. So unfortunately, this also translates to difficulties paying the rent. I mean, literally paying the rent. The findings are that women who are repaying student loans, about 1/3 of them experience financial difficulties while repaying loans, compared to about 1/4 of men. This also varies across race groups, and again, Black and Hispanic borrowers have the most difficulties. With Black women, most Black women, actually 57% who are repaying student loans experiencing financial difficulties. That would mean making ends meet, ability to pay the rent, utilities, etc. So this is pretty bleak, but I think it's also important to point out that, again, these degrees are associated with more opportunities and with better earnings. So we want to keep things affordable and open as much as possible. So that's why it's important to point out that, unfortunately, there is a burden happening for women that's disproportionate. So about 56% of US students are women, but because they take on more debt on average, they take on about 60% of initial student debt. And because they pay back more slowly, they hold about 64% of debt because they hold their debt longer. So again, that comes out to about $830 billion out of the $1.3 trillion in the United States. So what does AAUW say we should do about this? Among other things, of course, we support strong state and federal funding of the higher education system. The price of college is part of the issue, and if that price can be brought down, that will help all students, especially women. We also support fully funding and, where possible, expanding Pell Grants for low-income students. Low-income students, obviously, the most vulnerable to taking on large amounts of debt, and the more they can finance their education with grants and not loans, the better. Addressing non-tuition costs like housing and childcare is also extremely important. Childcare in particular is a gendered issue. So a lot of college students at this point, over a quarter, have dependent children while they're in college, and they need to afford childcare, and that is, as I'm sure many of you know, extremely expensive. We also support helping borrowers access income-driven repayment plans. Those are plans that help them set a payment amount that matches their income level rather than just a flat payment amount. We also support their ability to refinance their loans and to discharge in bankruptcy. And lastly, AAUW has a long history of supporting action to eliminate the gender pay gap and the race pay gaps. And this is obviously a critical issue for addressing student debt because women can't pay back their debt if they're earning 20% less than men. And that's going to be the end of my talk. So thank you all for listening. And we're about to have a panel. And I'm going to introduce you to the panel. So our moderator is Betsy Fisher Martin, the founder of Fisher Martin Media. And our panelists include Professor Tressie McMillan Cottom of Virginia Commonwealth University, Professor Sarah Goldrick-Rab of Temple University, Ann Hedgepeth from our own AAUW, Brianna Ross, the president of the U.S. Students Association, and Jennifer Wang, the DC Office Director for the Institute of College Access and Success. So please thank them for showing.
Thank you, Kevin. And as you heard earlier, AAUW has been in the business of advancing women in higher education for well over a century. So it is an honor to moderate today's timely discussion on student debt. The latest AAUW report, Deeper in Debt, Women and Student Loans, puts a sorely needed gender lens on the problem. And for many women, it's a catch-22. We need the degrees to carve out a decent living, and yet the price we pay is much higher because of a number of factors, including the wage gap. However, these challenges aren't insurmountable. Just as we made progress as a nation and recognize that women should be educated alongside men, we need to step up to today's challenges. The experts here today with me are clearly the go-to people to talk to when it comes to addressing how student debt is burdening women. Before we get started, though, I just want to remind everyone that we would like to hear from you, so please tweet your questions using the hashtag #DeeperInDebt. We'll get to as many as we can following this panel discussion. I want to start with Tressie.
Well, thank you.
In your new book, which is wonderful, I saw your interview on, with the Late Show the other night. You were great. Lower Ed, the troubling rise of for-profit colleges in the new economy. You argue that the labor market is increasingly forcing workers to seek out credentials and degrees in order to get and keep jobs, which of course in turn means that taking on student debt. Given your work and of course today's report, do you think the pressure for credentials is affecting men and women differently?
Oh, absolutely. So, and again, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Kevin. Very pleased to be here with panelists. It's very nice to be on a panel full of women, by the way. Let me just put that out there, and thank you everyone for coming and participating in that. We should do that more often. Okay, so yes, is the short answer to that question, right? The longer answer, which is probably what people would expect from me by this point, is this. Everything that Kevin described as sort of the macro conditions for why student loan debt is a gendered issue is most acute for women, clearly, including things like the wage gap, but I would also point out things like the wealth gap, right? Both of those things are operating in tandem to create increased demand for jobs, which in turn creates a greater incentives for people to participate in the credentialing process, and exacerbates the sort of cumulative disadvantage that women, but in particular that women of color have, and having equal access to what I call favorable higher education regimes, right? So favorable higher education would be those where the risk for participating is relatively low, right? So that even if the cost is high, it's not high relative, first of all, to your income and wealth position, but also that the labor market is going to reward it equal to, or ideally greater to, what you have invested in it. So more so than just cost, I like to think about this as a risk position, right? So everything that Kevin described is particularly true for women, as we know, which is why we're here today, but is especially true for women of color, and is most true, to be most specific, for Black women who are participating in higher education. And that is because of all of the way the labor market treats Black women differently, right? So if there is a wage gap, there's especially a wage gap for Black women, right, as we know. If there is a gap in job quality, which by gender, which we know to be true, it is particularly true for Black women. If there is an income gap, it is especially true for Black women. So all of those things end up working through not just gender, but also through race and class to make the issue of student loan debt a particularly salient one for women, but especially for African American women. And that is driven by the macro changes in how African American women participate in the labor market.
And just to follow up on that, can you address, just because this is your area of expertise, the for-profit colleges and what we've seen in this report in respect to the amount of debt that people are getting from taking out?
So Kevin, the report does a wonderful job of sort of breaking out some of these trends by institutional type and by race and gender, which is very important. So we tend to usually do 2 of the 3 and don't tend to do all 3. And that's and you're missing a very important part of that story. So the big macro story that Kevin told, as I understood it, is this, that at the same time that the likely student in higher education has become a minority and become a woman, the cost for higher education has increased dramatically, right? And student loan debt participation has increased dramatically, right? So all of those things are happening at the same time. Well, the other thing that's been happening with that trend line has been the massive expansion of for-profit higher education, right? Not just at the associate's and bachelor's degrees levels, which I want to point out, very fine point in the report, but the rapid growth at the graduate degree level, which means what we are capturing in higher education at this point, and one of the things that I argue lower ed is, we are capturing women generally, but especially women of color, in a lower tier sector of higher education that is most expensive, where they are most likely to take on the most debt, are most at risk for defaulting on their student loan debt, thereby exacerbating all of those income gap issues, childcare, employment, and housing, making them economically insecure across all the other major domains of life. And that is intimately tied to the rise of the increase in participation in the lower ed sector. We became a browner, more female higher education population because lower ed expanded, not in spite of, right? We have not done an equally good job of diversifying the student population at less risky higher education options. It is not that Harvard has become browner, right? It is that there are more universities of Phoenix, right? And so you do not solve the student loan debt without solving the problem of why women in general and women of color in particular only have as their practical option a high-risk higher education option like lower ed.
Sarah, I want to ask you, and we'll go down the line here, another accomplished author. Your recent book is called Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream. You make an argument in your book for a system of higher education that is truly affordable for Americans. You also publish research on the struggles, the tragic struggles, really, facing poor college students, including those who are homeless, dealing with food insecurity and hunger. What are the resources that our most vulnerable students need to be able to graduate from college without debt?
Right. Well, thank you for the question. I think that first I want to emphasize that a lot of the struggles that I'm writing about are no longer only the struggles of people with the least amount of money who are in college. These are now the struggles of the middle class as well. And so to the extent that there are disparities by gender and race, and they are persistent and large, I think that to some extent there have been the lessening of some of these disparities by class, but that's actually a very sad story. So what it really means is that as the price of higher education has risen over time, and I want to clarify, it's really the price, not the cost, right? A lot of the accusations leveled at higher education are about their inability, the colleges and universities' inability to contain costs. But what's really happened is that the costs have been passed on to students in different ways. And in fact, as Tressie just explained, as American higher education has become browner, more female, etc., the costs passed on to students by states have risen. It is as if they've said, welcome to higher ed, we're done here. We're not helping in the same way. And as that has happened, that has caused the increase in the debt burden. Now, the main thing driving student debt, though, for most folks is actually not tuition. It's the cost of living. And the cost of living in this country has risen even when states have not wanted to discuss that part of college. So while they've claimed, for example, like my former governor Scott Walker has, that he's making college affordable by freezing tuition, he's ignoring that the cost of living in Wisconsin has continued to rise nonetheless, and the fact that financial aid was not increased, therefore, fell hard on Wisconsin's students and their families. But that has meant that not only are lower income students facing challenges paying their bills, but the middle class is too. So for example, in our work on food and housing insecurity in higher ed, we are now finding that it is not disproportionately Pell recipients, the lowest income people, who are at risk. It is both Pell and non-Pell. Now, part of that speaks to the Pell Grant's inability to assess need in an accurate way, and to the inability of some folks to traverse the ridiculous FAFSA system in order to obtain Pell Grant status. But it also speaks to the fact that these days, a woman can come from a family that would think under normal conditions it had sufficient resources to pay for college, only to get there and to discover that the real price of college is so beyond reach that she may even struggle to put food on her plate on a reasonable and regular basis. This does disproportionately affect women for many, many reasons, including that they're more likely to have children while they're in college, but also because their wages in college, even while during college, not even post-graduation, are also lower.
And you present some solutions to this, some things that
Sure.
we should be doing. Tell us about that.
Look, I mean, I present solutions because I think we have an imperative at this point. This is a crisis that we can't afford to ignore. I don't know who benefits from ignoring it at this stage, especially when I'm talking about people not even having basic food on their plate or a roof over their head so they can afford to learn. There are many things we can do. Many of them are very common sense solutions. So we have policies in place that do a lot to prevent additional child poverty, for example, than we see right now. One of the most important food programs in this country is the National School Lunch Program, and it abruptly terminates as a student graduates from high school for no good reason. They need to continue on for college. We know that they need those degrees, and yet that program does not exist for them in higher ed. Similarly, the SNAP program, the food stamp program that's so incredibly under attack right now, is nonetheless really hard to get, and even harder to get in many ways as a college student than as a non-college student. So if you do not have a child, you're told that you have to meet a 20-hour-a-week work requirement, and yet college doesn't count. That makes very little sense in a country that, for its economy, needs more college-educated workers. I do also argue that it's time to move the discourse from a private goods-focused model of higher education, one that frankly contributes to growing student debt by justifying it, claiming that all the benefits are private returns, to one in which we focus on the public good. And that would mean that we would have tuition-free and ideally even tuition and living cost-free public higher education, beginning with the first 2 years of college where students are working to obtain those certificates and associate degrees, which do have tremendous value.
Continue on policy prescriptions. I want to ask Anne. AAUW has a long history of being an effective voice in government on issues affecting women, such as campus sexual assault, paid sick days, family leave, and the Violence Against Women Act. How does addressing student debt fit into AAUW's history of advocacy for women and its current policy agenda?
Thanks. I really appreciate the question. I'm thrilled to be a part of the team at AAUW that's working on this issue, student debt and how it impacts women. AAUW is 170,000 members and supporters strong across the country, and we have this tremendous long history of connecting research that really puts a gender lens on things that are happening, to policy solutions that can make a real difference. I think of a few recent examples, like our look at sexual harassment and violence on college campuses and how that helped us advocate for the Campus SAVE Act, which has led to more data and prevention and awareness in higher education. We've also, for a long time, done work to connect issues around pay equity, analyzing the gender pay gap, and then successfully moving things like the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and just this year working on bills that address pay equity in 42 states. So it would naturally follow that we want to ask questions about what the experiences are of women in higher education and maybe how they might be experiencing these things differently. And that's really what this report, Deeper in Debt, has showed us. And the analysis and those findings, I think our hope is, will lead to some real action, be a jump start for some of the policy solutions I know we'll keep talking about during the panel here today. And ultimately, I think we're hoping that folks who read the report and those who are here and watching will join AAUW and be a part of our community as we advocate for some of these solutions, knowing that they could really have a big impact on women's lives moving forward.
Speaking of questions, just a reminder to please tweet your questions so we can get to them at the end of this discussion. Hashtag Deeper in Debt. Brianna, the U.S. Students Association has represented college students around the country for decades, working to advance their interests and create social change. For instance, advocating for free public college. When you talk to today's students, who are mostly women, how are they feeling about their own personal student debts and the student debt situation more generally, and what are they doing in response? It's got to be a huge stress.
Oh boy, in this current political climate it is. I would say that the women are definitely, of course, despite frustration, are leading a lot of the mobilizing, organizing, and advocacy efforts on this. So I think it has a two-tier structure. One, back specifically because of what's going on right now, a lot of folks are pushing for free public college back in their states, progressive states such as New York and California and Oregon, where the political climate is a little bit different and the idea of free public college is more possible. Another thing that folks are doing is educating folks, making sure people know what they're signing when they're signing on to their student loan contracts. And I think one of the things that we've noticed that's been a trigger of this issue specifically has been financial literacy. A lot of the folks that I work with are women of color, low-income folks, are first-generation students who are the first in their family to go to college and are really navigating the system. So they're really trying to give back to their communities and making sure that they share that knowledge.
That's great. So just, signing on the dotted line here, you're
Yeah.
educating people to actually read what they're signing and
Exactly.
learn how to advance that. Jennifer, the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS, is that right?
Yes.
Provides a very valuable research and resources for people who want to understand student debt as an issue facing Americans and advocate for change. For instance, your class of 2015 report breaks down state-by-state data on student debt. Where are the best and worst states for student debt, and where are we seeing policy changes for the better?
So I have some figures. It's very like TICAS to have some figures. Like you said, we do publish an annual report every year, and we look at student debt by state. High debt states tend to be located primarily in the Northeast and the Midwest. So I'll just do the top 3 high debt states. The worst one is New Hampshire, where the state's average debt is $36,101. I will get to that in a moment. The second worst, or the second highest debt state is Pennsylvania, where average debt is $34,798. And the third highest debt state is Connecticut, where average debt is $34,773. And this is for the class of 2015. Low debt states. Utah is the lowest debt state as of last year, where average debt is $18,873. So when you compare that to what average student loan debt in New Hampshire is, I mean, it's almost half. It really is low compared to the 36,000. Second lowest debt state is New Mexico, where average debt is 20,000. And then third lowest debt state is my home state of California, where average debt is 22,000. And you asked, where are some good things happening? There are some states that have really shown their true colors when it comes to investing in their students. And the vast majority of students go to public institutions. These are public four-year colleges and universities, and these are also public community colleges. And so a state that wants to invest in students and families can make the decision to invest in higher education at these public institutions. These are high-quality institutions that have great outcomes. What some states have chosen to do, I suspect New Hampshire is probably one of the worst actors, is disinvest from students and families. And what that does is make the cost of college, as Sarah said, shift from the state government onto the backs of students and their families. And the results of that have largely been in the form of student debt. And so if there is a gap in cost and the state is saying we're no longer going to put money into this, we don't value higher education for our constituents, then students are going to take out more student debt. And a key piece of this is, a key piece of college affordability is need-based grant aid, right? Which a lot of people will be familiar with the Pell Grant, which is the federal grant that is need-based. But there are also state grants, and when a state says, I'm not going to make sure that the state grant matches the true cost of college, what you're going to get is a more expensive price of going to college.
And speaking of the policy, we're here in Washington. Obviously, there's a lot going on. And the president's budget is now out. So while part of this city is talking about other things, there are some people that are focused on the policy and budget component. And his proposed budget would really make deep cuts to some of these federal programs that we're talking about. So I want to ask you all generally, and feel free to jump in here, if his budget were enacted, how would these cuts affect college women and their student debt?
I'd love to start by pointing out that, if this research report tells us anything, it's that the status quo of our existing programs is still inadequate. We're seeing that women on the flip side of their degree are experiencing financial insecurity. They're struggling to repay their debt, and in particular, women of color are struggling. And I would say then that anything that does that walks back federal programs instead of strengthening and expanding them will lead to more problematic outcomes for women students. I think about some of the things that are in the proposal, cuts to Pell Grants, cuts to financial aid, to subsidize student loans, to work study, to the child care program, the only one we have on the federal level, the C-Campus program that helps parenting students. That all will pay down the road, or result down the road in women having a harder time, women students. Certainly the budget has many more steps to go through. I think there's a lot of space here for Congress to do the right thing, but I also think there's going to take some willpower from students and hopefully from institutions of higher education and other stakeholders to say this would be the wrong path to go on if we're looking to invest in students and in families and in our future economy, which needs these workers, these educated workers.
So Brianna, you touched on that a little bit earlier, the students' activism and what they can do to kind of make their voices heard in this political process.
Yes, I think thinking about the long term, just one thing to kind of touch on your point, this is an explicit attack on women, specifically women of color and women from low-income backgrounds, and I think that's something that's really important to name. But I think something that folks can immediately do, one, of course, doing lobbying efforts and really putting pressure back home on the local level, as great as it is to have folks here that are doing great work in DC, students that are actually in the districts where these respective representatives are making decisions need to be lobbying them, phone banking them, doing direct actions, but also figuring out through an electoral lens who is up for re-election next year, and how can we pressure folks to make sure that they're standing on the side of students.
No, I think she did a wonderful point and brought up what I wanted to bring up, which is that this would be a particularly hostile budget, owing a lot to the point that it is a proposed budget, it's a wish list. But a wish list tells us about our nation's priorities, right? And this is a wish list that deprioritizes women, and especially women of color. It is anti-women of color, right? It would exacerbate every cumulative disadvantage that already constrains the mobility of black women in this society, thereby impacting the intergenerational mobility of black children. Because black women take care of a lot of social institutions. The primary one that we care for, both financially and socially, is the formation of the family and raising children. So this does not just impact black women, but disproportionately impacts black families. Some of the things that I saw in speaking to women who, again, are in some of the most vulnerable parts of higher education, in for-profit colleges, for example, is how important childcare was to the decisions that black women had available to them. So we could make college free, and if you don't have anybody to take care of your children, it still won't matter for most black women, right? It still won't matter for a lot of women, but again, especially for black women. This creates a vacuum for, again, risky credentials to be the only solution for black women who are, again, being systematically cut out of every social policy program designed to make them more impervious to negative financial arrangements like student loan debt. So we can do all of the right things, but if we don't support and do the wraparound services that are so critical for black women to maintain their primary role in their communities and their families while also pursuing higher education, it really won't matter for some of the women who are accruing the most debt and are made most vulnerable by the increase in student loan debt. And this budget proposes a wish list for a nation that would say that that is morally and politically acceptable.
I would add that there are many of those who voted for this budget who would be very much hurt by this budget. And their moms and their sisters and their daughters People in the South are going to be disproportionately hit by this budget. People in rural areas are going to be disproportionately hit by this budget, and that includes with college. You know, in much of the South, the Pell Grant is the only way that you get to pay for college. It might sound good in theory to pull back on loan programs because you don't like debt, but that's incredibly naive. Because in fact, there's no other way to pay for college right now without those loans. So pulling back on them before you've made college affordable will just constrain people from even being able to go and get the technical certificates and such that they need to be able to do even the most basic jobs in their communities. So this is going to hurt future police, future firefighters, nurses. I mean, folks who just want to get medical care are going to have a harder time getting it because we pulled back on higher education opportunities in their very own local communities. And I think what's so heartbreaking is to see them vote for it and push it without really realizing what the consequences are going to be.
Jennifer, I know your organization put out a big press release just about the budget and what was in there. So you want to give us your thoughts?
I have so many thoughts.
Yes.
I have so many thoughts about this. So I echo all of this, but this budget is a recipe for higher student debt. Like, student debt will go up, greater inequality, and a weaker economy. And I have some more figures, of course. It would be nearly 150 billion. That's billion with a B, in cuts to grant aid, work study, which was always, by the way, like a bipartisan issue, right? And student loans, which will force millions of students to take on even more debt. It undermines the Pell Grant. It raids 3.9 billion, again, billion with a B, from the Pell Grant reserve, right? Like that is showing the students across America, the low-income students across America, like where they fall in like the order of priorities. It increases the cost of borrowing. It eliminates subsidized loans, right? And I have an example based on a teacher. So teachers typically have roughly $44,000 in student debt. Teachers often have to go to graduate school. And they make, on average, a starting salary of $36,000, roughly $36,000. And under this proposed budget, the income-driven repayment plan has a 30-year repayment period. And under that plan, teachers would pay more than twice as much on their student loans, which is over $50,000 more than if they paid under 15 years. And so, I mean, we've already mentioned nurses, we've already mentioned firefighters. It's just appalling to know that if this becomes a reality, there will be teachers paying over $50,000 more for their education. Right? These are teachers. It's awful.
I think though that Jen mentioned something important, which is that several of the things we've all talked about have historically had widespread support in Congress. And indeed, a lot of the efforts have been to perfecting and improving these programs, at least in a lot of bipartisan conversations. And I think that there's a lot of space, although it is frustrating that this is where we are, that we are having to push back on cuts from a status quo that's already untenable for so many students, that there is a lot of space to ask for those voices in Congress and in state legislatures across the country to speak up for students. And it appears that that's going to be incumbent on us all to do in coming months. And I hope that some of the information from research that many folks up here are doing, things like AUW's report, help make the case for why we need to strengthen, we need to move forward, that these are real people in real jobs that are critical to our communities, and women across the country who are experiencing the effects of this type of proposal.
Right. Last week there were major headlines about consumer debt, people taking on more and more consumer debt. Student debt is up there on the highest level. Looking toward the future, what are some long-term systematic changes that we need to be making to reverse this trend of increasing student debt?
I would say I think my sound went off. Or
Here we
is
go.
it back?
Okay.
I would say that the first thing we need to do as a country
Yeah.
is agree that we need to increase need-based grant aid, right? The Pell Grant covers
So you
the
increase that, student debt goes down.
people would borrow less, right? And it does not match the rising cost of college, right? The Pell Grant has just not kept pace. And I think the second thing, to allude back to what I was saying before, is that states need to decide that higher education is a priority and invest in public education for their people. I think both of those things together have the most opportunity to fix this issue. But I agree with everyone on this panel that unless we agree as a country that we're going to invest in students, debt will only continue to get worse.
I think we've got a political rhetoric issue when it comes to college students, right? So one of the things that I find is we talk about college students in a way that we would never talk about K through 12 students, right? Which I think is just about the historical lag of the number of people who participate in higher education and thinking about how everybody has to participate in compulsory schooling, of course, but people choose to go to college. And I think it's really important for those of us who believe in the value of education as a public good to push back on the idea that college is something that we are choosing, right? Really, we're not. The labor market has chosen it for us, right? You are going, anything that is saying that you have to have a completion agenda without paying attention to these other things is really missing half of the story. The labor market has created a set of incentives that says higher education actually is not a choice, right? It is a choice in the way that going hungry or eating is a choice increasingly for millions of people, especially those that are the most economically vulnerable. So we've got a political rhetoric issue that I think probably needs to trickle up from the states to the federal level. I think that when states care about those things, it's because they have to deal more intimately with their constituents, right? And so those of us who know these things intimately, I think can play a very vital role in reshaping sort of that political rhetoric to give people the tools to talk about higher education in similar ways that we now talk about K through 12, which is you've got to have a very good reason to come for our children in K through 12, right? College students have seemed to be fungible, right? But that is, again, not paying attention to what the labor market is in the 21st century. And then I think also, as we talk about, with Sarah, I believe in free college, but not just tuition-free college. I believe in free public college, and I would like for us to start to add that modifier, right? Because free college at all institutions is not necessarily good for all students who are participating in higher education. I'm actually not in favor of a system that would make it easier for students to go to for-profit colleges, for example, right? I'm interested in a system that will make it possible for more students, especially students of color, to go to high-quality institutions that have wraparound services that can transform their life trajectory. And we know historically that those are public institutions by and large, as well as minority-serving institutions. So shifting our focus to start talking about not just access to higher education, but access to quality education, and quality relative to the people who are participating in higher numbers in higher education. It gets paid for the way that we pay for everything. Yeah. This is what I mean. We pay for K through 12, right? And granted, this has to happen a lot at the state level, and I'll turn it over because I know Sarah's about to explode. But the idea seriously that we cannot pay for it is just not true. It is about whether or not we think we should be paying for it. It is never a question about whether we can.
Yeah. Well, let's be clear. We're wasting a lot of money right now. I mean, the one thing the conservatives and I will agree on is there is a heck of a lot of waste in the current system. And it includes the literally billions with the B dollars that we send to for-profit colleges and universities right now. And that frankly, we send to all sorts of private institutions which we exert no control over. We get nothing in response. So if we want them to admit certain students or broaden their access, we don't get to say that. If we want them to not charge high prices, we don't get to say that. We have no say, and yet we spend billions and billions. We can stop doing wasteful things.
What are we spending money on for-profit colleges? Can you explain that?
Actually, I'll give that one back to Tressie.
What are we paying for? We're paying for the profit and for-profit. Right, so their profit is profit in the for-profit college sector is the extraction of tuition dollars over and above the cost of operating the institution. 96% of students enrolled in for-profit colleges use the federal student aid system to pay for their tuition in for-profit higher education. So quite literally, it is the transfer of public dollars from the public student aid system into private profit regimes. So it's coming from tuition dollars, which are largely being paid for by the student aid system.
So it's coming from your pocket.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I do think we have a problem where most people in this country don't realize that. I wanted to pick up on something that Tressie was saying, though, which is that I say this as a mom, we've got to start telling the truth to our kids. And I feel like we've created a system in which we've told everybody forever that hard work matters. And we've created a system in which it really doesn't. You can work and you can be talented, and yet family income and race and class and gender, it will determine what you're going to get, including access and completion in college. And that's more true today than it even was 50 years ago. And so I think that if we want to look our kids in the eye, if we want to say work hard, it will matter, then we have to create a system of financing and accessing college that matches. And that's what we never did. That's how we got here. It's not like we haven't had these ambitions before. We never really put our money where our mouth is. And I think it's time for, those of us that have been through it to take a hard look at ourselves in the mirror and say, are we going to fix this, or are we going to let this go on for another generation?
And I think that there's a real point here, which you had started to allude to, is about some of the values decisions that we make, and ultimately that policymakers are faced with the opportunity to invest in a program like Pell that targets money towards students who are low income. We could work to improve the way they're accessing the grant, and those are tangible decisions that we could work on in Congress that would have impacts on students, on women students, and I think that those are conversations that are really critical to have. Also, one of the things that we haven't talked much about yet that is a big part of the way AEW is thinking about some of this research is, of course, the way that the pay gap is playing a role here, and the fact that there is still discrimination in the workplace. There's still challenges that women workers in particular face. And again, it's a place where we're faced with decisions that policymakers can make that can also be happening at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, all towards a goal of setting up a system that doesn't punish women who are making a decision to invest in their economic security, who are working in jobs that they would like to be a part of our economy, and yet are experiencing some of these disparate impacts. And I think that that's really a critical conversation to be had too when we think about changes that we can be making and changes that we can be making fast.
And I would say to the AAUW's point, seriously, one of the greatest higher education policies that we could do would be a jobs policy, which is the target here. You can improve job quality, especially gendered jobs. So all of the examples I noticed everybody mentioned up here of the ones that are hardest hit by student loan debt are gendered occupations, ones where women have historically and contemporaneously are overrepresented. Teachers, right, nurses, right? These are also, I would point out, occupations that are expected to increase over the next 50 years. As our labor market becomes more gendered in the occupations that take up the proportion of the paid labor market, it is also going to inherit all of those race and class dynamics. And one of the greatest things we could do is make it so that working class women can make the same choices about higher education that the children of wealthy people can make. Meaning that you don't have to choose between having job stability and going to school on the third shift and taking out a student loan to do so. Well, one of the greatest ways we could do that would be to narrow the wage gap, to improve job quality of the fastest growing share of jobs in the labor market, and to give those women the same sort of choices in higher education that wealthy people have.
I was going to say something similar, but related. I mean, making work pay would go a long way to reducing student debt, period, right? And so the Fight for 15, for example, matters a lot here. The cuts to the work-study program are stunning to me. This is a program with a 98% satisfaction rate. Where are you going to find that in a government program, right? The GAO found that everybody loves this thing, and yet it's already incredibly underfunded. So I don't know how many of you know that only 1 in 10 Pell Grant recipients in the public sector, Pell recipients who should all be getting work-study, only 1 in 10 are getting a work-study job right now. That's how underfunded the program already is. So to slash on it is incredible, and the consequences are enormous. We just looked at homeless students in higher ed, comparing those homeless students even just to housing insecure students, right? Let's not even talk about the good situation where you know you have a roof over your head. The big difference is not that homeless students try less hard in school or have less financial literacy or anything like that. What's different is they're far less likely, when they are working, which is very often, to be making at least $15 an hour. I mean, if we can address that, we don't need to be talking to them about what they do with their money or don't do with their money or anything else. We need to make work pay.
And I think one point that was previously mentioned about how are we going to pay for this?
Yeah.
One thing I feel like is the elephant in the room is the corporatization of higher education and how it's being run like a business. There are massive billion-dollar endowments that are on college campuses, different, like for the UC system, their contract with the Wells Fargo and all these different, where the priorities are being pushed in different states are put into for-profit industries, are put into corporate industries, and are not put into students. So I think that is something that we also need to be having a conversation, particularly for those that are working with universities and college campuses.
Before I go to some closing thoughts, I'll get to you 1 second. I want everybody to please tweet questions using the hashtag #DeeperInDebt. Go ahead, you want to make a point?
To echo all of
Yeah.
this, I think one thing that we cannot lose sight of in this discussion about student loans and student aid are the probably imminent attacks on consumer protections. Because there are, if you look in the media, I mean, yes, student debt and student loans are often written about, but if you look in the media, people are starting to tell their story about how some hole in the consumer protection space allowed them to slip through it, and now they have X number of dollars in student loan debt and nothing good to show for it, right? So there are some schools out there that make promises to students that they do not keep, and we know that the people who are most likely to default on their student loans are people who did not finish college, and there are multiple reasons for why people do not finish college. And the second group are people who get a worthless degree or a degree that does not pay off from a school that just does not invest in that quality of high quality education. And so things like, I feel like everyone up here has discussed this before at one point or another, but consumer protections cannot go away as we're discussing the federal budget, as we're discussing the future of higher education. And there are numerous consumer protections in the student loan space that really prevent people from getting deeper into trouble beyond whatever their student loan balance is, which is quite often very shocking. For instance, you can declare bankruptcy on a whole bunch of different things that you have in your financial life, but it is exceptionally difficult to declare bankruptcy on your student loans. Another instance, I think, if you're borrowing a private student loan, for instance, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to make the monthly payment. I mean, this is and a lot of people don't know the difference between federal and private student loans, and I think that the government has a key role in making sure that people understand the difference, but the government also has a key role in making sure that lenders and for-profit colleges and companies don't get away with defrauding people.
Do you have one piece of advice for students navigating this?
We've got a document on our website called like the top 10 tips for student loan borrowers, and the big one is to know your loans. Right. And I think that it's really important for people to understand what they're borrowing. But again, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there need to be stronger consumer protections in this area, because it cannot just be on the individual, right? Like there is so much evidence out there of fraud in higher education, and you cannot rely on people to just like pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Like if you read some of these stories about people who were lied to, there are stories from folks who say, oh, they told me to sign on the dotted line, and they told me I was getting a grant that didn't have to be repaid. And it turns out it was thousands and thousands of dollars in student loans. Like that is illegal, and we can't ignore that. So,
all have heard about these marketing schemes that go on, right? Especially in for-profit.
For-profit
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you, I think the
And
state of
everywhere.
New York is about to
Yeah.
engage in something very similar, where there's more than a 20% chance that their so-called free college program is actually going to be a loan for students. You know, we're seeing this, it's creeping across, and I think that, you know, we have to be very careful. I'll tell you the one piece of advice I give students.
Yeah.
Vote. Every single family, every single parent, you got a preschooler and you're starting a 529, voting is more important than that 529.
My advice is always find a union, like a union, join a union.
Done. Anybody else with advice?
I would make a plug, as I said earlier, it's probably in the vote vein, but it's also in the advocate space, and these stories are compelling, and the opportunity to engage around policy changes there, from the local level to the state level to the federal level. I know we're working at AEW to make those kind of things happen, but so are many other people on the stage, and so there's a space to be an activist if this issue speaks to you, if it's already impacted you, impacted someone in your life, and ultimately there is so much that's happening in our in government that impacts these stories and these experiences that we need to shape it and hold people accountable for their decisions.
Brianna, any advice?
Yeah, educate your peers.
Yeah.
Agitate, all of the folks around you, specifically the decision makers, and organize to push for more progressive policies.
We have a lot of great questions coming in, so let me go right to those. Let's see, how is the wealth gap different than the income gap, and how does that affect college access and affordability? This is from a Facebook question.
The income gap is the
Yeah.
gap in, so wealth and income, how are they different? This is my basic social lesson,
Yeah.
so okay, here you go. All right, this is exactly how I would do it to my students. Right, so no, income is what you earn, wealth is what you inherit. That's the simple answer. How does this shape access to college? Well, one of the primary ways that we have financed college and have expected people to pay for it is not based on your income, because college students don't have any, by and large, right? I get them in my class every year, and I say, raise your hand if you're middle class, and everybody's hand goes up, and I say, now raise your hand if you made more than $52,000 last year. All the hands go down. You actually are poor. What we have, however, based the system of financing and higher education on is your family's wealth position, right? Which is part and parcel. It does take into account their income, which I know Sarah could talk about this a lot more, because I think it should take into account more indicators of wealth. But has allowed families to hide their wealth to a certain extent, so that the children of wealthy people can use the federal student aid system to sort of increase their investment position later on in life. But what we have done is created a system where if your family has more wealth, you have greater and better choices in higher education than if your family does not, because wealth is how we assume you'll take care of all that other stuff Sarah talks about so eloquently. Your housing, your food, all of the cost of attending college, right? Income is how we base whether or not we'll help you pay tuition. And those are actually very different things. And so what we see, for example, that's the reason why you see so many students in high-risk, high-cost institutions like for-profit colleges have negligible family wealth positions, even when they have high income, right? Even when they have high income. And what has really shaped their points of access have been the fact that they cannot afford the opportunity cost of leaving the paid labor market to make a better quality higher education choice for themselves and their families. And that is because of the cumulative extraction of wealth from lots of communities, but again, in particular, the racialized extraction of wealth from African American communities, of which black women are really at the center of.
And just to be clear, what the FAFSA also doesn't care about is not just wealth, it's debt.
Yes.
So just to pay forward this lesson about who's going to be saddled with what debt they're still going to have going forward, it isn't going to be asked about on your kid's FAFSA. So they do not care.
That you're still paying your own
That you're
student
still paying
loans
your own
while
debt
you
when
take
you-
out your
Yeah.
kids, right?
Sarah, let me ask you this question about college affordability that came in on Twitter. What are some of the reasons that college has become so expensive?
The number one reason that college has become so expensive, remembering the lesson that Jennifer told us, is that most people go in the public sector, and states, as more people have said they want to go to college, have put in less money on a per student basis. It is not true that states spend less than they used to. Just want to be clear. They're spending more, but on a per student basis, which is what you care about for your price, they're putting in less. So the prices at public 2-year and 4-year colleges were not nearly so high, say even 10 years ago. And folks who keep saying, well, community college is basically already free, especially if you're from a low-income family, have just shown us how long ago they went to college. okay? Or talk to anybody who went to college. This happened rapidly, and it was because of state behavior. Now, there are at least two other kind of things that are going on that actually we spend, I think, too much time on, right? One is we believe there's bloat, administrative bloat in particular. Now, a lot of that is being said because people are worried we're not spending enough money on instruction. And I do think we're not spending enough money on instruction. And we know perfectly well that we're treating our instructors terribly in higher education, the way we are in K-12 education, and that it's hurting our students. But a lot of the other positions that have been created are student support services, and we got to be honest. If you want your student in the classroom, you do need to support them. Now, whether or not we are spending too much time with staff on social cohesion activities rather than ensuring their basic needs are secured, that is a real question. The other issue is everybody seems to be competing to be the most expensive school. And we need to acknowledge that somehow Americans have gotten the wrong idea. They think the higher the price, the higher quality the school. So institutions, and this is especially true of private institutions, have tested the waters and found that if they hike the price, more of you will apply.
It's basic marketing, right?
It's ridiculous. So we need to teach them the opposite lesson. And I was pleased the other day to see a young woman, actually, who said, in the interest of financial security, I'm saying no to Northwestern. Okay, now, plenty of people wrote on my Facebook saying, that's not a good idea, Northwestern's amazing. Well, they didn't offer her much in the way of aid, and she would have come out with more than $85,000 in debt at the end of the day. I think she made a good choice, yes. And I think if more people could look at those schools and say, really? Now, you have the right to do that. You can charge that. But here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not sending my taxpayer dollars to you anymore. Because that's the truth. It's not that we want to tell private institutions what to do or what prices to set. It's that we get to make decisions about who we subsidize.
And I think to a point Brianna made earlier is that institutions also can talk and speak to some of these issues around values and priorities. And they certainly have a lot of data and information about the price of their education and the opportunities they're offering to lower income students, students who are non-traditional. And you could certainly, I think as that becomes something that we value and that institutions can provide quality education while meeting those needs, that's a space too that I think schools could move into rather than this sort of race to the top in price.
You're being so kind. I want to acknowledge you. Are you being kind? And I was about to say, and since I often don't have the same incentive to be as tactful, I want to put a finer point on that. We have a leadership vacuum in public higher education of people willing to say these things. We have plenty of public higher education leaders who are willing to advocate and say, we're the most entrepreneurial institution. We're the most corporate, right? We are right? We have plenty who are willing to operate in that space because they think there are financial incentives to do so. We have a leadership vacuum, however, in public higher education leaders who are willing to stake out ground on the fact that higher education should be more affordable for students.
Brianna, we were talking about financial literacy earlier. This is a question from the audience. Is there a right amount of debt? No.
Hello.
How do you figure that? I mean, how?
Well, one, education should be a right and not a privilege, and it should be free and accessible to all. I know that the current reality of which that is different. But I think one of the things that we need to really focus on is that I know in the Deeper Debt paper, it really beautifully illustrates the history of universities and how they were built, and they were not built for women. They were not built for people of color, therefore, or low-income folks. Therefore, they are built to push them out of those systems. So I think there is no right amount of debt whatsoever. I think that was a trick question.
You're right.
Does anyone else want to?
Well, I would certainly add that, it's tough sometimes to operate in a space where we are dealing with policy fights just to keep the current system, to push out on making that better, and also to really talk about a radical shift towards debt-free approaches. And I think a lot of us are trying to do all of those things at once, which is to say, we would like to get to a place, right, where the answer is there's no right amount of debt. How can we also make sure that while we're getting there, we aren't doing it on the backs of students today? Because that is then a 30-year proposition that we're continuing to set up. We will see that throughout our lifetime.
But if you're a student, from a practical standpoint,
Right.
you need to weigh certain things. How much debt you're going to take, but what sort of career do you want to go into?
And I think this is a space where there's a lot of room for continued innovation and also pushes from Congress to make that information better available, better accessible, and usable by students. Some efforts were made over the past 8 years to at least bring some of that data to the forefront, make it digestible, but we didn't quite get there. And it can be difficult as you enter into higher education to sort of sign on a full lifetime of decisions around this. I think anything we can do to provide the support services that Sarah was talking about to help with those decisions, to continue financial literacy, and to make the costs of college much less for students, I think that makes a big difference.
Right, and I think even on that point, Tressie was saying earlier that even just say you had tuition-free college, you still have to pay for housing, you still have to pay for transportation, books. I have worked with students who have had to choose between books and eating, and that is a problem. And I think at large, I know we want to make sure that we are, the top leaders in business and all these other things, but we are not, as the American people, the top leaders in education. And what we need to be realizing is that millennials and the next generation are going to be the future doctors, the future teachers, and how much are we investing to make sure that we're giving our kids, and when I have kids, a high quality education.
Here's another question from Facebook. I'm not sure who might know the answer to this. Are more women than men co-signing loans for their children and grandchildren? Do we have any data on that?
Yeah. Let's say, so the closest that I have is just qualitative data, but yeah.
I would suspect the answer has got to be yes, because there are more female-headed households.
That's what I was about to say.
Right,
in my sample.
and especially that would be true among those who would need to be taking on the debt. So, I mean, I'm thinking about what we saw with the Parent Plus loan fiasco, where we, in a very paternalistic way, decided instead of lowering the price of college, just restrict the ability predominantly of African American women to be able to send their kids to college. That we know fell more on black women than anybody else.
I was just about to say what's important here. While I don't know the exact statistic, I think there's a way for us to maybe reason our way back out of this, right? So what tends to matter when you're following the FAFSA is who is the head of the household. We know what the distribution of head of household is by race, class, and gender. So what you could probably expect is probably women overall, roughly maybe slightly over half, just like women are slightly just at about half of heads of household, but that is dramatically higher for African American women. Actually, I think it's followed then by Asian American women than Hispanic women. That statistic is usually inverse for everything else racialized, right? But so it would be one of those things where if we just assume, if we work back from who is the head of household, and since that's most likely the person who usually fills out the FAFSA. Again, I talked to like 119 students currently enrolled in for-profit colleges, and just qualitatively, the older women in that study were refinancing second and third student loans for themselves to stay employed. So they're the ones doing the master's and the graduate degrees in for-profit colleges so that they can stay employed, so they can be promoted. And they were also then taking on, and they were having frequent conversations in their social networks about, will this impact my ability to get a loan for my kid, right? Will they take into account that I have already a loan for my kid as I now go and reapply, right? And they were having and sharing that sort of information. And the system of student aid doesn't account for that at all. And they were absolutely sort of living that reality.
Here's another question from Twitter. Jennifer, you might know this. How do you feel about forgiving all student debt? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think I have a point to make about student loans as a tool for college access.
Yeah.
Right? Like Sarah alluded to this earlier, but the solution for college affordability, given our current environment right now, is not just to take the student aid system away from people, because we know what might happen. We release a report every now and then. It's not annually, but the most recent one is called States of Denial. And what's really shocking about what happens when you take student loans away from people is that the answer is not good. The result is not good. So across the country, there's nearly 1 million community college students in 32 states, so 9% of community college students nationally, that are going to schools that block all of their students' access to student loans, to federal student loans. And I really do worry that if we don't contextualize like why people borrow, I mean, they're borrowing money to go to college. And if you take away that opportunity, I worry that they're not going to go to college, right?
This is why some of the conversation, even on the left, about debt is dangerous, okay? Attacking the government for making student loans. You might not like the terms of those loans, and we can negotiate over those terms, but look at this budget. It's pulling back on the Perkins loan. That might sound good as a soundbite because then people won't get that debt, but I promise you, this means more people won't be able to pay their bills. Things are going to go by the side because they didn't have that loan. We have to be careful to not blame the government for trying to give people the only thing it currently has to give them, or to blame the Department of Ed, for example, for doing its best to ensure that we give out student loans without putting credit checks on them, because these are not regular financial products. These are opportunities that we're trying to hand out, and I worry so much that if we want to lower the interest rate or if we want to make the terms better, it will come at the expense of it being accessible to all. Because who's kidding who? We know who they won't give a loan out to if they start treating this like a regular financial product.
And it's really unfortunate to then see students who don't have access to the federal student loan system borrow in the private student loan market, or leave school or finance their education on their credit cards. Like, we all know what interest rates are for credit cards. Like, that's extremely unfortunate. I will make one more point about student loan forgiveness. For us, it is absolutely critical to maintain the light at the end of the tunnel for people who are paying on their student loans and things just did not work out, right? So we believe if you have been paying on your student loans for 20 years, there needs to be a light at the end of the tunnel at that time. Because if you still have a balance at that point, something probably did not work out. You probably did not get the degree that would help you compete in the economy. Or maybe you had to leave school, or maybe you went to a very low quality school or something. Like, without preserving that light at the end of the tunnel, I really do worry about how many decades people will be paying on their student loans. And I'll also make another point about student loan discharge for people who have been defrauded. You know, it is your legal right under the law to say, I am asserting a defense to repayment, and I'm telling the federal government that I don't need to pay back my student loans because I was defrauded. And if we get rid of that protection, if we get rid of that consumer protection for all the people who've been defrauded, for instance, at Corinthian colleges or ITT or ACI, I mean, these are all people, many of them, who have been promised that their student loans are going to be forgiven and that they'll be getting refunds because they were defrauded. Like, if we get rid of that consumer protection, these people will not have a chance at all. I mean, I can't imagine what that must be like. And the fact that many have been waiting over a year for their student loan discharges after, multiple investigations, multiple states attorneys general have there's too much evidence out there of the wrongdoing. Yeah, of the widespread fraud and abuse, and it is just, it's unconscionable that they've been waiting this long. Like, we need to protect that consumer protection.
Brianna, I have a little bit of a lean-in question here for you from Twitter. Do you know if women are negotiating or questioning their financial aid packages?
Oh boy. I remember, frankly, a lot of friends going to the financial aid office, and I don't want to say bargaining the amount of financial aid that they were getting, but making sure that they were able to get their financial aid in time to register for classes. I've had multiple friends friends and students that I currently work with have had to take off a semester, have had to take off a quarter because they did not get their financial aid packages in time. So I've seen that happen a lot more than the latter.
Can women negotiate financial?
Yes,
Can these packages be negotiated?
Yes, they can.
In the
And I
admissions process?
suspect that women may be less likely to do so, just like we're less likely to ask for the compensation that we deserve. And this can play out even for the very most vulnerable folks. So, I mean, let me tell you, that you can go in and talk to your aid officer. You may have living circumstances, for example, that don't align with what their expected cost of attendance was for you, and you need to go explain that to your aid officer because they have the right to make something called a professional judgment, to adjust your budget. Now, they often don't do it, and I'm very sympathetic to them. I actually think the majority of aid officers are also deeply underappreciated, totally overworked, and beleaguered by so many rules and regulations that they can't actually see their way to doing their main job, which is to be compassionate and serve students. Now, it boils down at the harshest ways for the students who are homeless, because the aid system not only asks you to report on the FAFSA if you're homeless, it then asks you to prove it. How do you prove you're homeless? Well, you need a piece of paper. Let's say you were homeless in K-12 school, and so your high school can provide something. But let's say you weren't, and so many folks are newly homeless. What you need to know is you have the right to go to your aid officer and ask them to perform an interview with you, which allows them to vouch for you that, in fact, this is happening. And if more students would do that, they would qualify for more financial aid so they could get out of this situation. As it is, only $58,000 a year, and that's still an unconscionable number, are in fact verifying that they are homeless. But we estimate that it's possible that as many as 1 million college students are in fact homeless, and you can see the gap there. You've got to ask for that help.
Jennifer, I want to ask you this question that goes to what you were talking about earlier with the states. This is a question from Twitter. Do states with lower average rates of school loan debt have less students attending school, more state funding, or both? And what is causing the disparities from state to state?
Good question. Let me have a look. You know, there's really kind of pretty intense variations. And so, like I said earlier, the statewide average debt levels for the class of 2015, which is the most recent data that we have, they range from over 18,000 to over 36,000. And the share of graduates with debt in the states also range from 41% to 76%. So it's not, it really is kind of those two things at work, right? Like in the low debt states, it is probably the case that there's lower debt because the cost of college is lower, but then there's also probably fewer people who need to borrow. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's many levers that a state can pull, right? Like they, like I said earlier, can make the decision to put more money into their state need-based grant aid system, which would reduce the amount of student loans that people would have to take out, starting with the lowest income students first, right? Like that's a very targeted reform to get at college affordability for the people who are lowest income. But a state can also make the decision that they're going to put more money into their merit-based aid system. And to me, that's kind of a misguided decision to make, because then what you're saying is we're going to give students more money based on merit, and we're not going to take into account whether or not they're low income or moderate income. And so what I would urge for the higher debt states is to look at how much they're putting into their need-based grant aid system and boost it. I mean, there's no question that if you doubled need-based grant aid, people would borrow less. And the same is for the federal level. Like if we doubled the Pell Grant, people would borrow less.
And I'd love to also make a plug for a few other things that states can be doing that we've sort of alluded to. You know, the first is this conversation around debt-free, and we certainly have seen several states try to lead on this. And I'll lift up that I think we're seeing some stronger proposals and weaker proposals, and it's good to weigh what our priorities, but places like Oregon really doing, I think, a good job putting together a way to approach that. We've also seen states take on things like Students' Bill of Rights approaches, information and ombudsman, and that's something that I'll just mention Connecticut's one of the states that's done. And in addition, I've already alluded to the fact that states can take on pay equity issues. So we've seen California, Maryland, Nebraska, Utah, a long list of places even in the past few years tackle that issue. And so these numbers on a state level can really, I think, fuel some work in places where there's a deep interest and maybe not the will at other levels of government. So I think it's very valuable to think about state innovation and state response to this particular issue.
I agree. I want to highlight Tennessee.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to highlight a state headed by a Republican governor who's doing a phenomenal job. You know, I think many of us know that Tennessee was the first state to offer tuition-free college at its community colleges, it was to recent high school graduates. He has now expanded that, right, up the age range. And this is really important because if we simply had a targeted need-based program like the Pell, it actually always advantages full-time students over part-time students, still leaving those part-time students short. That's a case in which the tuition-free actually really disproportionately helps those older students who get less from that targeted program, those part-time students.
That's the community college.
Exactly, and so it's a really interesting thing to see Tennessee come together around this. It also has managed to do something, we critique last dollar programs all the time. What that means is that the state is asking that first you do the FAFSA and get what you can get from the feds, essentially, and then they'll put in. But it's had this interesting effect that it has gotten people who otherwise wouldn't have filled out the FAFSA to fill out the FAFSA. And that's a good thing because they're less likely to end up, if they're going to take debt, they're less likely to end up with a private loan or putting it on their credit card because at least they're getting access to the public loans. I think it's been derided, but there's some promise in there, and part of it is a very clear message to students that the state does care if you go to college, and the message, at least on the tuition side, is that it will be zero, which is so different than saying it will be, quote, affordable, which I think students all over the country have discovered is a false promise. And that is the ultimate betrayal, right? Because we've even told low-income students, look, folks, you will be all right. They are not all right.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. As a former TV producer, I always want to end right on time. So I want to thank you all for, all you wonderful ladies, for a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Vice President of Marketing and Communications. And I have to agree with Betsy. I could have listened to them go on for hours more. Fabulous. Thank you all so much. I don't know about you, but I felt like a bobblehead the whole time. It was fabulous. And I hope those of you joining us via live stream enjoyed it as well. AAUW thanks you. We thank our members for their support, particularly the Moonin Lecce Giving Circle, who always makes our research a very special project of theirs. And I'm sure that this is something they're very excited and proud to be part of. So we got all riled up, right? Now we need to do something. And I'm going to leave you with 4 things you can do. One is join AAUW. We're a community of 170,000 members and supporters, 2,000 communities, 900 colleges and universities. All right, add your voice. That'll only get stronger, and then we can do something about this. You can find a branch or a student organization near you by going to our website. Our fellowships and grants, as Gloria spoke to you in the beginning, $3.7 million every year. We've been doing it since 1888. So if you are looking to fund your graduate education or know someone that is, and to what Tressie said earlier, one of the best parts about our funding is it does not have to be paid to the college for tuition. If you need it for childcare, you need it for childcare. So the money is yours to make your educational dreams come true. And lastly, I'm going to throw a shout out to Ann's portion of AAUW, our policy and advocacy folks. We have a 2-minute activist that I invite everyone to join, and you'll know what you need to do and who you need to be saying what to, so we make a difference. Thank you all for joining us.